Indie horror games, huh? There's something else, aren't they? Like a what's the word? A blend of like raw creativity, but then also that creepy factor you mentioned.
Yeah.
And you're right to be like a little intrigued by the, what did you call it, the dark side
Yeah.
of all this, because it gets kind of complicated when we bring in itch.io into the mix.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah.
And what I think is so interesting about itch.io is that this lack of oversight, it really is a double-edged sword.
Okay.
On the one hand, it allows for this incredible creative freedom, this diversity that you just would not find on like your heavily curated, console storefronts and things like that.
Right. Right.
But the flip side of that is that it really puts the burden on you, the consumer, to be discerning about what you're downloading, what you're playing.
Totally. Yeah. And when you first brought this to me, what was it about? About like this whole thing that kind of like, what was the hook for you?
It seemed like you were really drawn to the psychological horror aspect of it all.
Yeah.
Like how these games, especially on a platform like itch.io, where there's so much more freedom to experiment, how they really start to blur the lines between the player and the experience.
Yeah. Totally. And I think that's a great place to like really dive in, because we know itch.io, it doesn't have the same kind of content restrictions that you'd see like on a PlayStation store or, something like that.
Right.
So what does that actually, like, what does that mean for a young person who's playing these games?
Well, I think you have to start with the understanding that horror, right? Like at its core, horror as a genre is designed to evoke really strong emotions.
Sure.
We're talking fear, anxiety, stress, even.
Yeah.
And for adults, engaging with those feelings in a safe fictional space, it can be cathartic. It can be a way to work through things.
Right.
But for younger players, and this is where it gets tricky, their sense of self, their coping mechanisms, all of that is still forming.
They don't have the same like emotional toolbox yet.
Precisely. They might not have the same defenses against fear that we as adults have developed.
Right.
And certain games, and again, we see this a lot on itch.io, they excel at getting under your skin in ways that more mainstream horror might shy away from.
Because it's not just about jump scares and stuff. Right?
Yeah.
It's like we're talking about like messing with your sense of reality.
Exactly. Remember that game you mentioned, what's called Game Title?
Yeah. Yeah.
The way that it uses a specific game mechanic to create this constant sense of paranoia, right? Like, it's a perfect example of how these games can worm their way into your mind long after you've stopped playing.
Totally. And that's I think where the real heart of this is that it's easy to dismiss it as, oh, it's just a game.
Right.
But are we potentially overlooking some of the impact, especially on younger players?
And that's the million-dollar question, isn't it? Because on the one hand, you have people who find genuine release in exploring fear in that kind of controlled environment.
Sure.
But for others, those boundaries can be more permeable.
Yeah.
And that's where context becomes so crucial.
So it's not about like, shielding kids from anything remotely like spooky or whatever.
Right.
It's more just acknowledging that they might not process it the same way, especially without guidance.
And guidance is key in all of this because you have this incredible opportunity, right? You have this incredible opportunity for creative expression, for exploring really complex themes, for pushing boundaries in ways that we haven't even thought of.
Right.
But on the other hand, there's a responsibility to protect those who might be more vulnerable to the potential downsides of that content.
Yeah.
It's a tough line to walk.
Yeah, it's a tough one for sure. And it's not like we can just like, throw up our hands and be like, oh, no more games.
Yeah.
That's not really realistic.
No, not at all. Especially in this day and age where it's just so intertwined with how kids are growing up, with how they're
Like Coach said,
learning.
yeah.
It's about giving them the tools and the knowledge to navigate this world responsibly.
Okay, so then how do we actually do that? Like what does that look like when we're talking about something like as potentially intense as some of this indie horror stuff can be?
Well, I think it starts with communication.
Okay.
Having those open and honest conversations with young people about their gaming experiences.
Yeah.
What are they playing? How does it make them feel? Are there any themes, any images, anything that's kind of sticking with them that they're finding troubling?
Like really creating that safe space to talk about that stuff without feeling judged.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. And alongside that open dialogue, alongside that communication, we also have to remember the more practical tools that are available.
Yeah.
Even itch.io, for all of its emphasis on creative freedom, they do have parental controls.
Right.
You can filter content, you can set limits.
Yeah, and that's a whole other like, can of worms. But I think what's interesting too is that you mentioned, the cathartic aspect of horror.
Yeah.
So it's not all like doom and gloom, right? Like there's
No, not at all. There's
think about it this way.
yeah.
For some people, especially those who are, kind of naturally drawn to those darker themes, horror can be a way to safely confront those fears,
Right.
to find release in those fictional scenarios.
Oh, interesting.
And remember how we were talking about certain games, how they kind of get under your skin?
Yeah.
Now, that can be unsettling, yes, but it can also be incredibly powerful.
So you're saying there's a potential for like positive transformation in those uncomfortable feelings.
Precisely. It's like, how some kids are drawn to scary stories.
Right, right.
There's a thrill in facing those fears, but in a controlled environment.
Yeah, yeah.
And for some, it can be a way of processing, maybe some anxieties or fears that they're dealing with in real life.
Right. It's about reclaiming a sense of agency in the face of fear.
I like that. I like that a lot. And it's almost like it's less about demonizing an entire genre
Right.
and more about recognizing that there's a spectrum.
Exactly.
Well-
There's a spectrum of content. There's a spectrum of responses to that content.
Totally, yeah. Yeah, it's like any art form, really.
Exactly.
Like what might be really intense for one person, someone else might be like, whatever.
Exactly. And that's why, going back to what you were saying earlier, that open communication, that's so crucial.
That's the key.
Because it's not, there's no one-size-fits-all approach here.
Right.
Especially when we're talking about, younger audiences.
It's not like a here's the rule book, follow it kind of thing.
No.
Yeah.
It's messy, it's complex, there's no easy answers.
Yeah, it's definitely a conversation, not a lecture.
100%.
It's a conversation that I feel like we need to be having, not just like within families, but like as a society, right?
Yeah.
Like how do we as this culture that's just, more and more reliant on technology, how do we balance that with that incredible creative freedom that we see in a place like itch.io, but also the responsibility to, protect younger audiences, because it's not about censorship.
Right.
It's about finding that sweet spot, right? Where creativity can thrive, but without causing unintended harm, especially when we're talking about. Yeah.
It's a question that has no easy answers, honestly.
Right.
And what makes it even more interesting, I think, more compelling, is that this tension, right, this push and pull between, expression and protection, it's not confined to, like, the world of indie horror games. You know what I mean?
Totally.
Think about it, like books, films, even like the art that you see hanging in a gallery, like these debates have been raging for centuries.
Yeah, totally.
Where do we draw the line? Who gets to decide? Like these are.
Yeah, and it's almost like creation, like the act of creation inherently pushes boundaries,
Totally. Yeah.
And as technology like advances and changes and we have these digital worlds that are just becoming more and more immersive, more intertwined with our lived reality, it's only natural that those anxieties about like influence and impact they're gonna amplify.
And it's funny you use the word blurry, because I think that's the perfect word to describe it.
Yeah.
It's getting really, really blurry.
It is.
Which is both exciting and terrifying.
Totally. Yeah. It's and I think that's kind of what we'll leave you with today is that there's no right answer here. There's no easy solution, but it's definitely something to chew on, to think about, like within your own relationship with technology, with art, with the games that you choose to play, to share with maybe younger folks in your life.
Yep.
Like how do we move forward in a way that honors like both of those things, like that creative freedom, but also that responsible engagement.
And what excites me, at least about all this, is that it's not just a conversation for like, one group to dominate. It's a conversation for everyone, creators, parents, gamers themselves, like everybody has a voice in this. Everybody has a perspective that's valuable.
Because at the end of the day, it's about shaping like a digital future, right? That's both creatively like vibrant and interesting and exciting, but also ethically mindful.
100%. Yeah.
Right.
Absolutely. And that's a future worth striving towards.
Totally. Well, on that note,
yeah,
I think that about wraps up our deep dive into the world of indie horror games.
Yeah.
So until next time, stay curious, stay engaged, and keep those conversations going.
Absolutely.
Yeah, see you next time.
Mm.